Poetry? Yeah. It might turn out that we are real. Susan Scarlata. This is her bio. Susan Scarlata is the editor and publisher at Lost Roads Press, lostroads.org. Her book, It Might Turn Out We Are Real, was published by Horseless Press in 2011. She recently returned to the U.S. after 2 years of teaching and writing in Hong Kong. Please welcome Susan.
All right, thank you, and thanks, Jeff, so much for finding me. As my bio said, I am a recent transplant to San Francisco, and came here via Hong Kong, so a lot about Hong Kong will present itself in the poems I'm going to be reading. But I first wanted to say today's my mother's birthday, and she's very far away in Pennsylvania, but she's sick today, so that's the worst when you're sick on your birthday, so I'm going to dedicate my reading to her. Going to be reading poems from a new project that is entitled Trade. Living in Hong Kong, you really cannot avoid commerce in every way that it is possible is there. I mean, everything that's being made, that's ending up everywhere, made in China, is very close, and pollution is there, and you're in malls all the time, and it's very, very hard to adjust to at first, and now it's been very hard to adjust back to the U.S. So that's what you're going to hear a lot of. I'm going to read 3 pretty short poems and then something longer to finish off. Thinking about trade, it's been a very long process of thinking about it at macro levels as well as micro kind of exchanges within oneself, as well as large exchanges, stock type, really, really large things going on. So that should all be in here. Okay. First title is Swapping Out. A swap is when a trade's not even. Don't you agree with me? The suburbs in D have been seized. This is happening. Ladder stairs, there on purpose. Skimpy copper, lossy iron. Between you and me, she's got a haptic sense for touch. The theater you fought in, the one corner of the cruise ship. Talk to me so as. Run your thumb across the sun. Cute is as cute does. So cute. Let's inflate together. One country blowing up said to another. Are you craven? The unsure anthem, the act weaning out the thing that's lost its luster. We need the seal fat tea, the glitter bomb to distract while we trade this tuba on the mariachi black market. My document has recovered. What emotion goes with this? Relief associated with an empty rain. Where'd you get that ego? Grain alcohol and rainwater, a funny way of blowing it. Corollaries. You all know the place called the world, right? It's like this and like that. It's the man in the suit in the middle of a field, the women trolloping through oceans in ball gowns, or looking down with bony hips and pouty mouths. It's where we all live, and also it has armadillos as leprosy vectors. It's by the light that the overseas maids hold that most things work out on most days. The property back home paid for through remittance sent back by the light of the shrines tucked in alleyways. To introduce a thing to a place is such long-tail thinking, possums and rabbits to systems on islands. It would be better had they never met. Consequential trades, the map of the possible, rewritten all over itself. We are leading while cutting the edge. We are avanting our guard. But how is your inbox? Study of scarcity, economy of words. There is Arctic unrest, and there are sea buckberry shrubs in foothills where no one will ever see the sea. This is titled Real, and it mentions towards the end of the poem first-person shooters. While I was teaching in Hong Kong, I was teaching at an art school that was very much focused on digital arts, so I had a ton of students that wanted to be video game designers, so I learned way more about video games than I ever thought I ever would, and first-person shooter is a reference to video games that are based on shooting and you're in the first person role. So real. Trade our sluggish cargo growth for an afternoon with crumpets. Trade this cloud pact, that data set, narcotics, swords, and exotics. Death to all that traffic. Still, let's give it a go, shall we? How much scarf, how much flourish? Basement dwellers, bottom feeders, flats beneath the gardens. Real doll or porn star, junk bonds or platelets. One for one and be my plus one. A committee of nations makes a code of conduct for space. We're all conducting more than anyone knows. Real die number 40. I loved it in that one drink I had. Just feel already. First-person shooters are all about hiding from lightning. Not really. First-person shooters should be just close enough to real without being too real. We all need to tamp it down now and then. Quiet our guns. Should we have seen a raptor by now? Patterns of interest present when things are dissimilar. I want the taste that fake dye makes, the color made up in a mind. Okay, so I'm going to read something that's a little longer and is related to the words and term gross domestic. So gross domestic product is what we all think of immediately when you hear those things together. And I've been thinking quite a lot about them separately, what gross means when it's not the pool and aggregate of things, and domestic, so affiliated with the feminine, and how those things come together to be this huge thing. And it actually came to me listening to the radio since I've been back in the States that some pundit was talking about, we talk so much about gross domestic product, and really what is being calculated in that are gross domestic transactions. So, and then thinking so much about trade, it immediately caught that little poetic part of you that is thinking about words in those ways. So this is called domestically transactions. Our gross domestic fossils and fuels, our gross domestic pipelines, the gross domestic space, the gross domestic tree planted in memory, the gross domesticity of plants, their continuity, gross domestic doppelgangers, gross domestic candlelit ends of things, gross domestic wax on the stove, gross domestic lists of edibles, gross domestic lists of lists, gross domestic allergic swellings, gross domestic houses, gross domestic small houses within houses having their miniature lives, gross domestic attributes responsible for aprons, gross domestic alcohol on the sideboard, gross domestic shared vocabulary, gross domestic cuddling puppies, their gross domestic entropy, the gross domestic coiling of phone cords, gross domestic alleluias, gross domestic passcodes, gross domestic motion, gross domestic infestations, gross domestic gluten, gross domestic fatwa, gross domestic exits, gross domestic tub drains, gross domestic shagging, gross domestic shipping lanes, something gross domestic and alabaster, gross domestic clotted cream and crabapple, my gross domestic helper of another skin, culture, tongue, our gross domestic helix shelving units, our gross domestic palatial accoutrement, our gross domestic suckling, gross domestic sump pumps, our gross domestic suede chaps, gross domestic clumsiness, the gross domestic ghost of my father, the gross domestic ledge of the bedroom, the gross domestic skinning room, the gross domestic Murphy bed, grossly domestic and resounding, gross domestic compost sludge, gross domestic reduction, gross domestic roux, gross domestic behind closed doors, gross domestic functionality, my gross domestic soul, gross domestic nagging, gross domestic amenities, gross domestic trinkets next to gross domestic tchotchkes, our gross domestic packing materials, gross domestic Northern European showrooms, their arrows, my gross domestic coup de terre, our gross domestic many Florida state, our gross domestic credenza, our gross domestic cravats, the gross domestic smell of the neighbors, our gross domestic shared heat and forced air, our gross domestic their ceiling, our floor, one's gross domestic hypertension, the gross domestic tides through the mangroves, the gross domestic methane, my gross domestic goo above the stove, the gross domestic perpetuation, the gross domestic driveways of twin houses by the gross domestic freeways, the gross domestic truckers' lounges, free showers, the gross domestic container ship, my gross domestic cargo, gross domestic pump jacks and gross domestic roughnecks, our gross domestic parklets, our gross domestic rainbow of extraditions, the gross domestic truckers, come in, gross domestic gigolos, gross domestic jargon, gross domestic dolphins in the shipping lane, gross domestic application language, gross domestic abstracting everything ever done, gross domestic values of the family, gross domestic transactions, the gross domestic renting of money, gross domestic pawn shops, gross domestic symbols and flags, gross domestic revolution, gross domestic indicators, gross domestic antiquity, gross domestic plastic snow. Thank you all for being here.